The strong recommendation of the paper is that whatever you're teaching genetics of mental disorders for, it's definitely stigmatizing, and you could probably replace it with evolutionary education and it would be much less stigmatizing.
I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with the people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more.
Dr. Tom Carpenter is a specialist registrar in psychiatry in Ayrshire and Arran and an honorary clinical lecturer at the University of Glasgow. He's also a member of the executive committee of the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and leads the trainee engagement initiatives for that group. He studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh after initially studying human sciences at the University of Oxford, completing a master's degree in research in animal behavior at Newcastle University. I know that's where you got your evolutionary training, Tom, and then you turned to psychiatry because it had a better job opportunities.
I suppose it was a bit like that. Yes, I think at the end of my masters, I had this thought that maybe I would go into research and behavioral science, which I think would have been really good, actually. But I had largely under pressure from my mother applied the medical school at the point of starting the master's degree, and it kept her quiet, actually. But I was roundly rejected from all the medical schools. But then I think it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks before the semester was meant to start, I got an email from Edinburgh saying, "Oh, would you like to be added to the waiting list?" I replied saying, "Sure, if I can sign into the waiting list." And then I got a reply by email saying, "Oh, actually, we've got a place. We just started you right in, so congratulations." And so, wow, big surprise. Yeah.
Well, I'm very grateful that you did because you are the foremost trainee or psychiatrist in training interested in applying evolutionary theory to the clinic, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about a bit today. But I'd be interested. Well, you've been on the podcast before, but just as a refresher, like when you were coming into psychiatry and you had this background thinking about evolutionary theory and how it makes sense of biology, what was your perspective? What was lacking, and what do you think the potential was?
I guess I wouldn't call myself foremost trainee, but I've certainly found myself in an interesting position at the moment, because you're right, I do have this interest in applying these kind of evolutionary ideas to psychiatry. And I guess it kind of comes from, yeah, I think actually I've had this kind of interest deep seated for quite a long time. I remember, this is probably what motivated me to study human sciences in the first place, was trying to understand sort of the deeper why people do what they do, because a lot of time doesn't make much sense to us why people are doing what they're doing. And actually, I came across some explanations. I think when I was at school, I was browsing the school library and came across, some kind of more kind of biological explanations for behavior and speaking about, you know, development and how development can be guided by the environment, but in conjunction with the genetic background, and that just really made it a lot of sense. And I was like, this is great. This is what I want to do. So then I did human sciences, but that doesn't particularly set you up for really particular paid work or anything specific. You have to be quite creative about what you did afterwards, which then eventually, and after a few things, they did the medical school, would give you the job, which is nice because it's the structure and stability, and then a platform to kind of apply these ideas in the clinic. So and so my clinical experience, I guess, has only led me to feel more strongly that there's definitely room for these evolutionary style explanations amongst the sweet specs that we do for with our patient.
Right. So yes, the reason that we are convening today to record this episode is because we've just finished maybe 4 years ago, we started thinking about this research. And then a couple of years, 3 years ago, we started actually organizing these sessions, particularly you in the UK. I was in Switzerland at the time. We will leave the listeners with the promise that there's some very exciting findings about to come out from a paper that we are both first authors on, a study that we've worked on for years, showing where these explanations might be useful. But before we get into the details of that, I guess that it's important for me to just quickly reminisce back like about 10 years ago when I got interested in the field, and I probably similarly to you, I just thought this is a really interesting explanation. I just wanted to understand what's going on here. But also, the clincher for me was that these ideas just seemed important in a way that many scientific hypotheses or theories aren't. I mean, there's a lot of science that's very interesting, and you're like, oh, that's how the world works. That's cool. Yeah, it's cool to know why the sky is blue, or that the Earth was once one big landmass and it's moved apart. But it's like interesting, fine, but it's not the same as understanding suffering and understanding why people are different and why people don't fit in. And it's just like this huge social problem, this thing that like really gets to people and that we've been kind of bashing our heads over and wasting billions of dollars on for however many decades, a century. I mean, over a century that, psychiatry has been kind of a force in itself and its own institution and kind of scrabbling in the dark to understand what's going on here. And it seems that the evolutionary perspective is just this incredibly useful paradigm for kind of revealing what is actually going on and that those explanations matter. And that was what really drew me to this, the background in philosophy is it's not just ideas, it's ideas that like have an impact. Anyway, so I don't know if you, what your perspective is on this as a clinician. And
Well, I kind of want to. I'm casting my mind back to when we first kind of had a proper
Conversation, Adam, because I think I just joined the EPC, the Evolutionary Special Interest Group. I'd been tasked with doing something for trainees and trying to engage trainees in the group because it was sort of it was trainees were underrepresented in the group's activities. Then we'd had this chat, hadn't we? And just because I didn't know anything about you at the time, and it was clear we were coming from the same direction, right? Where it came to thinking these ideas are actually really important, and let's get them out there. And I'd already had this idea about trying to distribute kind of evolutionary ideas throughout sort of the psychiatric training programs in the UK. And I thought, thinking pragmatically, how on earth are we going to do this? So I thought, well, let's develop a sort of an EPSIG, convener kind of program where we get people who are interested in different local areas to give a talk on evolutionary psychiatry to the local areas. And this was fine, but then we had our conversation. We thought, hang on, why can't we try and make a study out of this? And this had a few advantages, I guess. So I thought initially, I mean, man, Adam, you're really telling me that half of the people I recruit for this, I'm going to have to get them to give some kind of talk on something that isn't evolutionary psychiatry. Are you having me on? You were saying, Tom, that's for the greater good, and actually it'll have more impact this way because that we'll be able to publish something that other people will listen to us. I think you're right about, even though I was a bit grumpy about it initially. Half the presentations go on something else, couldn't do control group or whatever. But it had the other advantage that it was another reason to help to get people involved and get enthusiastic, because almost a billion psychiatrists in training, is that there's points of competition in the process, different as you progress up training schemes and for consultant jobs. And if you've got work on a research paper and you're a named author on a paper, then actually that gives you points or other ways that makes you a bit more competitive. So actually running if it's a research study, I think really then turbocharged it, because then people weren't just going to do it the fun of it or for a workplace-based assessment or something. They were going to do it because actually if they gave a presentation as part of this study, then at the end of it they get an authorship on the paper. So who got a lot more interest in the study, and then we were able to run it in loads of different places, which I think wouldn't have been possible otherwise.
right. So yeah, let's get into this. It was whatever, 4 years ago. You were running this trainee engagement initiative. I said, let's gather some data, man, please. Let's prove that this is useful. Well, hopefully that was the idea, right? Like, I was also very idealistic. This was like the first proper scientific experiment that I'd been involved in kind of really running. But I'd spent a lot of time listening to people like Saloni Ditani and Stuart Ritchie on openness in science and like strict gold standard open science practices in a way which was it was quite, it was slightly disabling. You understand that it is you're putting some sort of weight around your neck and having to go through these extra processes of rigor, which in the end, if you get the good results, are like it's all worth it and it's fine. But it was quite a struggle. So let's just talk a little bit about what we did with these trainees. So we had these groups of trainees. This group that we met through the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group. You reached out to them and said, "Hey, we're running a study. Who wants to sign up? You'll be a co-author." But we blinded them to what the study was, right?
Yeah, I'll start the story a bit earlier. It's all kind of
This whole thing is born out of the pandemic in a way, in that because when I first started being involved in the EPC, we were going through rolling lockdowns in various parts of the country. Glasgow in particular was under lockdown quite a long time, and people were looking a bit more, I think, for a bit of kind of connection or interest. So part of what I did is that trainees who showed an interest in evolutionary psychiatry, I would meet them like virtually via Zoom for like a chat to get to know you. So what's prompted your interest? Where you're from? What are your career? Things that you want, and just to get to know them. I must have done this with, I don't know, maybe like a dozen people. I think thinking now it's crazy that people were happy to just like sit at home and have a Zoom chat to 20 minutes with some random guy about some random topic at the other side of the country. And this I guess this was probably the seed of it, because then this was but this found, because then I had this personal connection to all these people, um, and this could be the seed from which the training engagement program grew. So I think I started asking these people, "Hey, do you want to do this study? And also, could you just tell your friends that we've got these opportunities?" And what we'd like is to try and get someone to do this in every teaching area of the country. It's worth talking a bit about the structure of, that this study made use of. And I think in psychiatric culture in the UK, in Ireland, and presumably other places in the world, but I just don't have direct experience of it, there's a really strong emphasis on teaching and learning. And so usually timetabled into your week is the ones there's like a morning or afternoon of teaching, where different consultants and resident doctors will take turns in presenting a case or a topic to their peers. And I thought this is a ready-made structure that we can use to get these ideas out there. So we said to these people, so that the idea is you'll ask whatever your local group is, can I have a slot for a presentation? It's on, up-to-date explanation of anxiety disorder. There will also be the option for attending to participate in a research study, their questionnaire for time, and took it from there. And it had a really good sort of snowball effect, in that people were willing to recommend to their friends, "Oh, hey, I know this guy who's running this study. Would you like to run it in your area? Just get in touch with Tom and he can set you up." And then it just kind of happened largely through these informal networks, with a bit of advertising through sort of channels like the EP mailing list and things. But that's kind of how it came to life.
Right. And so in the end, there are 51 psychiatric trusts in the UK, and we ran studies in 19 of them, I believe.
Yeah, 19. I think that's right. I mean, because it doesn't necessarily map one to one, like one teaching group to one trust. Because of course, you could have your group, you could have a forensic psychiatry teaching group and a child adolescent psychiatry teaching group, and they might be in the same trust. So I think there wasn't really an overlap between participants in the study, because they're all quite discrete teaching groups. But yeah, it showed the good reach in the study, in that we could, in say, a third of more the trustee UK, we could actually have them to our presence.
Right. We actually, I think, in totting up the areas, we had Wales, Scotland, North England, East England, West England, South London, literally the whole map. It wasn't just clustered around the South or the North or anything like that, which was great. And then we had a colleague in Ireland who ran some studies in Ireland, which is obviously not part of the UK. It was very exciting. Well, actually, I should say, this is entirely credit to you. You were organizing all these sessions. I was involved in study design, and then I kind of left it with you. And then we had a couple of years of, oh, there's a session going on, or, in on Monday, and can you be available to ask questions or whatever? But But yes, there was a couple of years of just kind of letting the data roll in. And initially we thought it would only take 6 months, but we kept it going for a couple of years because we kept on having new sessions arising, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every now and again, we think we could wrap it up, and then some more people pop and say, "Actually, I think I can get us this block somewhere." So we thought, well, let's
Yes.
keep the data rolling.
So we should explain also for the audience, as they're listening, they could access the preprint, which will be out by the time this is posted, to actually check out the study. But the basic design was giving these trainees a presentation to give in their local group, as you've said. One of the presentations was based on a recent review of Genetics by Ask et al. 2021. And then there was a chapter by Randolph Nesse on anxiety. So both were on anxiety disorders, explanations of anxiety disorders. One was just genetics, talking about GWAS studies. The other was evolutionary explanations by Randolph Nesse, who's worked in anxiety for decades and had an anxiety disorder clinic. And there was a chapter in the recent book. So basically, there were two presentations. They were standardized in being just kind of taken directly from the paper or the chapter. And then we asked various questions on stigmatization. The the educators giving the sessions weren't told what questions they weren't told whether how many arms there were in the study, and they also weren't told what questions were going to be asked of the participants, right? Like the participants just had to scan a QR code, open up the questionnaire. So it was very blind. We were basically double blinded. No one knew what the hell was going on. Everyone was just getting the education session and then filling in the questionnaire.
Yeah. I think actually it's probably worth at this point thanking all of the educators, because thinking about what they actually signed up to do really put a lot of trust in us, because we were saying, listen, what we're going to do is you sign up for this study to give to your peers that you can be embarrassed in front of, right? Or perhaps another teaching group somewhere more distant, but still, it's a group of people that you can make it complete fool at yourself. Necessarily. I mean, we didn't say this to them, but when you think about presentations of two, it's what you think, isn't it? And not only are we not going to tell you really what the study is about, but we're only going to give you the presentation materials a couple of weeks before. And you're just going to have to make the best of it yourself. And you're not going to get to see what the participants are seeing. You're just going to have to do your best with the presentation. Make sure they scan a QR code to complete it. And then trust us to then actually bring this thing to a completion, so that you actually get some kind of measurable credit for it. So regardless of whatever comes of our efforts to make a big impact out of this study, thank you, educators. It would be not possible without you.
Absolutely. No, totally. Yeah, now I think about it, it was a bit bizarre. And some of them were just friends of the people that you'd been talking to, and they just got, they got told this. Yeah, here's a study to run. It was wonderful that it worked, and we had so many interested people. I think it shows, to kind of make a more broader philosophical point about the state of psychiatry. I think like the young people are very interested in like better explanations in psychiatry. And when I've talked to the trainees, they are sort of motivated, and also at the evolutionary sessions, they are very motivated to think about new ways and to advance. They really do care. I think you hear some kind of psychiatrists sometimes get a bad rap online for being pill pushers or whatever, but in my experience, that's just not what people really do care, and they understand that the paradigm is not good enough, and they're just trying to help people the best they can. But yes, it was great, and well done you for organizing it, all of those sessions. It was ended up being very successful, although not as successful as we first thought, as we discovered. So Tom had been running all of the analyses using his University of Glasgow Qualtrics. Sorry, not the analyses, even data collecting with the University of Glasgow Qualtrics platform, and there were questionnaires which were given to the many, many people around the UK and Ireland. And you could see like how many of them would have been opened, but we didn't access the data.
Exactly. Well, thanks to your gold standard, science conduct, I didn't look at the data at all, right? I could just see it rolling and see how many numbers people had clicked into the questionnaires, but little did I know that actually it recorded a number for a completion, for a partial completion.
Yes. So there was a moment of horror when the strategy we used to keep it as unbiased as possible, like basic problem that's happened in the psychological sciences for the last well, decades and decades, is then when people kind of statistically fish through all the data. So we could have got all this data in and then spent days, weeks, just kind of trying to find weird correlations and only reporting the specific correlations which kind of fit our story about how evolutionary psychiatry is incredible. And we all are human. And that's what people were doing for most of, as I say, the recent history of psychology. But to try and avoid that, what you have to do is you have to pre-register your analysis plan. Really, we should have tried to pre-register before the data collection, but we didn't know how much data we were going to get, and it was all kind of running on, and we didn't really know what questions to use. So you kept the data, you didn't look at it. Eventually, we pre-registered the analysis we would run. We had 7 primary hypotheses based on specific items from that study. You sent it to me, and then I analyzed it. But when I was opening the data, we thought we had 470 responses, but all like half of them were people who just opened the questionnaire and then just didn't even bother to go through the consent form. Which, to be fair, the consent form was quite arduous. You had to initial 7 different statements.
I mean, in practice, I think if I was doing it, we probably didn't need that. But probably a yes, no would have fine. But I hope we were just being a bit over robust, weren't we?
Yeah.
Because
Anyway, it's
and then
2 signatures.
sign it. You have to sign it with your finger on your phone. It was
We had 2 signatures, 4 different consent forms. That was probably a mistake. Anyway, but it doesn't matter. I think most of the people actually didn't even reach the second consent form where they had to keep signing. I think a lot of people they just didn't want to. They kind of opened it and they were like, oh, I can't be bothered. I'm just going to listen to the presentation.
which is fair enough. That I was happy to run it that way, because that way people get to a presentation they could have had access to anyway, in the normal course of their teaching. So they would.
Yeah. Right. So anyway, that's just the messiness of it all. We went down from 470 participants to 171 participants, 101 in the evolutionary arm, 70 in the genetics arm. But thankfully, it was enough. It was enough to have reasonable power, especially with the decent effect sizes, which I am foreshadowing the amazing results that we found. Anyway, so we had 7 hypotheses. We were comparing primarily the evolutionary arm to the genetics arm.
Yeah, and
So
worth actually, because I think we diverted off our discussion about the choice of the papers, didn't we, earlier? Probably worth talking about that just quickly. Why we did choose genetics versus evolutionary, right? And I think because there are all kinds of things that we could have tested evolutionary against, couldn't we? And one would be like you kind of like a gold standard biopsychosocial formulation, or like CBT type, explanations. And we didn't do that. Because we wanted to say we were presenting, an up-to-date explanation, so we're using an up-to-date paper on genetics. But then also B, there was something important, I think, we felt about we were testing the idea that disorder is intrinsic to you versus evolutionary viewpoint, which is more nuanced.
right. And I mean, there's obviously such a close link here that evolutionary and genetic are, the evolution is just the process which explains why the genes exist. It's just the genetics are much more mechanistic and don't have this story of why, really. It's just like, oh, there are genes. And also I think a good reason to pick the genetics arm is that it is an up-to-date, up-and-coming area of research. It's the new sexy thing. GWAS studies are getting a huge amount of funding, and people are interested in finding the genes behind the mental disorders. But the question that no one really ever asks is, because maybe it doesn't seem relevant, but I think it is relevant, is like, well, what's the implications of talking about the genetics of schizophrenia or autism or anxiety? We're very happy to do the science, but you don't really consider, like, how does this make people feel? And also, are people misinterpreting the results? I think that the idea of genetics is very deterministic. This is obviously what we kind of find in the study. Most biologists and evolutionary scientists will tell you, like, genes are not deterministic, that you can have the genes for something and they can manifest in a certain way, but every phenotype is created by an interaction of the genotype with the environment. And if you have all of the genes for psychopathy or schizophrenia or whatever, you probably still don't become psychopathic or schizophrenic, given what we now know about GWAS studies. But it's obviously that doesn't come across when you're talking about the molecules inside you which are making you act the way that it makes you diagnosably mad or bad or sad. So I thought the genetics arm was like a reasonable comparison. It also was pretty decent for semi-blinding our educators to not knowing whether or not they were which arm they were in or how many arms there were. So yes, I thought that was good. The interesting thing that we found was that, yes, as some might expect, the effects of the genetics education are actually quite negative, and the effects of the evolutionary education are sometimes quite positive, but then sometimes don't really do much. But then actually genetics is so bad that you should always just replace genetics education with evolutionary education. The strong recommendation of the paper is that whatever you're teaching genetics of mental disorders for, it's definitely stigmatizing, and you could probably replace it with evolutionary education and it would be much less stigmatizing.
And it's worth saying that we do that. Like, it's not that doesn't happen. In the exams that you sit to become a psychiatrist, there is a whole section on genetics. And when you sit there trying to revise it, it is maddening. And you just have to sit this dart exam and be done with it. But not only is it maddening, and people generally think it's pointless, but also turns out maybe it's all stigmatizing and unhelpful. You're right. Maybe that's an argument that psychiatric curricula need to change.
Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we had 7 primary hypotheses. I'm just going to list the questions that we had here. So they were all run on single items, and we derived these from existing stigma scales in the clinical literature. Although the literature on clinician stigma is fairly sparse and quite broad, and it's often about cancer and HIV and the various disorders. It's not usually mental health specific, so we kind of adapted it a little bit. But we asked questions like, given the information provided in this education session, how optimistic are you about the recovery of patients presenting with anxiety disorders? So do you think people will recover? And we'd also ask this pre-post. So we asked beforehand, given what you currently know, how optimistic are you about the recovery of patients with anxiety disorder? If patients were given the information provided in this education session, how willing do you think they would be to share their anxiety disorder diagnosis? If the information presented was publicly known, how would you rate willingness to seek psychiatric help for anxiety? Given this information, how effective do you think psychosocial interventions will be to improve outcomes? Then we asked a couple of questions about usefulness, just very simply. Do you think this information is useful for patients? Do you think this information is useful for clinicians? And then we also asked a validated scale on what's called negative usefulness, which asks questions about, do you think do you agree that negative emotions are just harmful? That negative emotions are not useful. So many of these questions, 5 of them we asked pre-post, and then 2 of them about usefulness we just asked after. And yeah, we ran the analysis, and wonderfully, the evolutionary arm outperformed the genetics arm substantially on every single question, which was actually frankly quite surprising. I was expecting maybe a few of them to be positive. I didn't expect all 7 hypotheses to show strong effects. The weakest effect, although it still wasn't that weak, there was like an 89%-ish probability of a positive effect of the evolutionary in comparison to the genetics arm, was on the recovery of patients presenting with anxiety disorders, which makes sense. I mean, knowing what you know about anxiety disorders, having a new explanation that maybe shouldn't change you that much, because these are all practicing psychiatrists, right? These are almost everyone has spent years in psychiatry. Anxiety disorder is going to run its course, whatever the explanation is. But the evolutionary explanation did still increase some optimism. And yeah, in terms of, so the strongest effect, which actually aligns with what Hans Schroeder found in his study of the functional explanations of depression. Hans Schroeder, who has been on this podcast, he found that the main effect of telling people functional explanations of depression was that they were less self-stigmatizing. So they were more willing for people to know about their disorder diagnosis and more willing to share a diagnosis, basically. And so here we actually found, yes, those were our strongest effects outside of the usefulness. The usefulness was ridiculously strong. in terms of these stigma measures, the thing that is most clear is that the evolutionary explanation of anxiety disorders is psychiatrists believe will make people much more willing to basically share and to kind of seek help for anxiety, which I can totally understand, right? Like, it's framing this person's problems in terms of this giant historical story, and it's not their fault, and this is just a part of being human. You know, if you have anxiety, it's absolutely understandable. You know, anxiety is there for a reason. All these anxiety responses are kind of based in some sort of defensive, protective response. They can get overactivated, they can get out of control, they can be incredibly harmful, but you shouldn't feel like it's, you know, just a broken brain. So especially in comparison to the genetics arm, clearly, you know, it's funny, even though they're basically equivalent and completely compatible scientific explanations, that you do have some genes which predispose you to being more neurotic and anxious. And there's an evolutionary explanation for why, you know, that tendency exists. But there is a different implication if you are told, like, well, you have the genes for the anxiety disorder. It kind of feels like, oh, there's something broken inside me. It is definitely interpreted, in my experience talking to people, but also as the clinicians think, it's interpreted in this kind of like, oh, I'm broken in some way, which doesn't come across in the evolutionary explanation at all, right? It's like, my system's working, but it's just a little bit out of whack.
Yet, and this is the system that I share with everybody.
Right. This is just part of being human. This is the human story has left us with these vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
There's less sort of pain there, isn't there? So you're talking about, I was thinking, as you were saying there, about, you know, willingness to share a diagnosis with somebody else. I mean, and that's one of the stigma measures, isn't it? What is it that stops you, say, you know, sharing diagnosis with somebody else? Probably a sensation of pain, isn't it? The kind of psychic pain that you're feeling. And so, you know, if we're guilty of giving people explanations that increase the amount of psychic pain they're feeling and the interactions with other people, that's probably going to be contrary to our purposes of getting people well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for the people who understand the standard deviations or want to know the actual stats here, the approximate standard deviation move that we saw on the latent assumed scale of the stigmatization was about a 0.3 standard deviation, a 0.2, 0.25, 0.3, 0.27 standard deviation move difference in between the evolutionary arm and the genetics arm, which is pretty big. It's also, the models we used were ordinal models, which calculated as well how likely you are to change your response to be more positive. So if you've marked a 3 in the pre-session for, you know, how optimistic are you about the recovery of patients, if you've marked a 3, then afterwards the question is, do you mark a 4 or do you mark a 2? Like, has it moved you up or down? Has the evolutionary or the genetics arm moved you up or down on that scale? And you're 58% more likely to move up the scale in the evolutionary arm than the genetics arm for the optimism about recovery. For whether the information, if the information was publicly known, how would you rate willingness to seek help? You were almost 80% more likely. The clinicians thought, the clinicians rated it, were 80% more likely to think that the evolutionary arm was better than the genetics arm, although 80% more likely to move up the scale. And that's actually almost a 0.4 standard deviation, which is pretty significant. So on the usefulness questions, so we asked people, hey, you know, just afterwards, just quickly, do you think this information is useful to patients, and do you think it's useful to clinicians? These results were ridiculously strong. I was completely shocked. So in one of them, in the question of whether it's useful for patients, there was 100% likelihood, which meant that the simulations that we ran, it was like a Monte Carlo simulations. We ran 8,000 simulations. Every single one of those 8,000 simulations, given the data, showed that the evolutionary arm was more useful than the genetics arm. So in every possible world, then evolutionary education was rated as more useful for patients than the genetics education, which is just like an astounding effect. There's an effect of a 5 odds ratio. So you are 5 times more likely, 500% more likely to rate more highly in the evolutionary arm than the genetics arm. And when you see the raw scores, basically it was a 1 to 5 rating on how useful do you think it will be. The average in the evolutionary arm was about 4 or 5. All of the ratings were kind of around 4 or 5, or a few 3s, but it was really kind of like the top 4s and 5s were being selected. Whereas for the genetics arm, it was more like 3, and so it was like a whole point lower. I think almost no one actually rated it as a 5, and maybe a few people rated it as 4, but many also rated it as 2. So this is like a huge difference in how useful the clinicians think evolutionary explanations would be to anxiety disorder patients, which is honestly astounding. I can't believe that odds ratio. It's ridiculous. It's a 1 standard deviation difference, which is, completely bonkers. Very cool to see that. I mean, I get it. Like, obviously the genetic, like, no, who needs to know the genetics of anxiety? Like, honestly, what are you doing here? Why would patients need to know? They don't need to know at all. It's just bad, really. Whereas obviously the evolutionary explanation, hey, here's a context for your suffering, and here's what's happening, and I can use this in the clinic. And so on this question of whether the information is useful for clinicians, there was still a 3 odds ratio. So they were still 3 times more likely to rate it as more useful than the genetics arm. Slightly less of the simulations allowed. It was only 99.96%, not 100% of the simulations allowed for the evolutionary arm to be more positive than the genetics arm. But still pretty huge, a 0.76 standard deviation move. And most of this was actually driven because the clinicians rated the genetics arm slightly more highly than like the 3s and 2s. They were just a little bit more optimistic. They were like, oh yeah, clinicians should know a bit of genetics. I mean, they have been taught genetics, so that is kind of part of the, it's the science, right? So I kind of get that they believe that they should be taught some sort of genetics of anxiety. Yes, that was quite cool to see. The negative usefulness as well. I mean, this almost doesn't need to be stated because, obviously the evolutionary explanation is talking about how negative emotions are useful. So this was almost just a sense check that people have been listening. But again, it was larger.
I think it's an important finding as well, because the whole usefulness of negative emotions is actually a big part of treatment for into the psychiatric practice anyway. If you're thinking about a patient who's got anxiety disorder or perhaps emotional instability more, a very large part of what the nursing staff and psychologists will do with them is about learning about what is distress. Let's learn how to tolerate this distress, and another thing is how to bring that distress down and how to avoid the triggers. But a lot of it is actually saying these emotions are not necessarily a bad thing to be avoided at all costs. They're we need to work with them. So actually, I think that the evolutionary explanations making clinicians feel that these negative emotions are more useful is that actually fits really nicely with a really useful psychiatric paradigm that exists already.
Yeah, awesome. Yes. I mean, again, this is why it seems so intuitive, but it is good to test it, right? I mean, the cool thing about this study is that I've been talking to people who have been working in evolutionary psychiatry for ages. Randolph Nessie's been talking about this and how he reframes anxiety to his patients. But you need to test it. You need to test, do the clinicians think this is actually useful? And then also, maybe the next steps, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but the next steps will be actually testing it on patients. Like, do the patients actually feel better? My prediction here, I'll go on record, is that I think they will. I think they will. At least in some context, it'll be interesting to see who is helped and who isn't helped. I think it's also important to kind of make a couple of comments on where these effects came from, because we're comparing the evolutionary versus the genetics arms here. However, that could be entirely driven by genetics just being really bad, which is not completely implausible. And actually, a fair amount of the questions that we ended up asking, although these weren't our primary hypotheses, we asked a load of questions that we didn't register as the most important things to look at. But yeah, so of the 4 main pre-post stigma items, so we had optimism about recovery, We had willingness to share a diagnosis, the willingness to seek help, and the efficacy of psychosocial interventions. Of those, 3 of them actually did show positive effects for the evolutionary arm, but one of them didn't. One of them, actually, the genetics arm was just bad, and the evolutionary arm was even slightly bad, but just not as bad as genetics. So maybe the listeners can work out which this might be. It was the efficacy of psychosocial interventions, which was actually one that we weren't originally going to include, but then my supervisor, Nikhil Chowdhury, thought we should include it. And then I'm sort of, it's a bittersweet sort of success story, the failure story here, because actually, no, the evolutionary arm makes people a little bit more pessimistic about the efficacy of psychosocial interventions, which is kind of interesting, right?
Right, and it's maybe something to do with because the evolutionary,
I guess brings in the effects of the environment, and this is your response to the environment, like partially, isn't it? So maybe there needs to be a bit of, if you were giving these evolution explanations, it needs to be clear what tools we've got disposable that influence A, the environment, and B, your interaction with the environment. So maybe if we were developing an evolutionary psychoeducation resource, it would have to include something that then moderated fatigue in the environment, rather than suggesting that really your systems are firing like this because the environment's so
Right.
all these systems are built the way they are, whereas actually there's the levers we can pull.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a lesson for us that like the flexibility that we realize evolution has kind of kitted us out with maybe doesn't come across in like an instant teaching. If you think, oh, it's evolved, it's sort of fixed. It's like I can't help it. I've got millions of years of evolution making me anxious, and yeah, I'm just going to be anxious, and there's nothing you can do. Which is, I don't think anyone in the field actually thinks that, but.
No, because the system has to be flexible to be useful, but and past the evolutionary explanations of thinking where it reaches its limits of flexibility, sure, but or where it's been, pushed too far in one direction because of its flexibility. The flexibility means that maybe, hopefully, it could be pushed back another way.
Yeah. So yeah, it's there's a lesson to be learned here, but actually people do still see them as fairly maybe deterministic, and it's something that the field needs to think about. Yeah, but I mean in general, very very positive results. And I'm not going to go into all of the exploratory analysis which we've done because people can read the paper. The one thing that I will say, the one other kind of very significantly positive result was in terms of depth of understanding. We asked people before and after, how deeply do you feel you understand anxiety disorders? And again, the evolutionary arm after the education session did increase much more significantly than the genetics arm, and also it did actually increase. So people did come out of the education session thinking that or reporting that they did understand anxiety more deeply, which is cool. And it's sort of what you'd expect, but it's great to see it in the data. So yeah, where do we go from here, Tom? What's the future? How do we yeah.
Good question. I think we've spoken to clinicians, haven't they? Which is should speak to some patients.
Yeah. Yeah, damn right. No, I agree. I mean, there's some like caveats to be made about this paper, which I think also justify it's actually quite hard to get these clinicians repeatedly, isn't it? We can't just keep running these studies. But like this was on a specific anxiety paper, like an anxiety chapter versus the genetics of anxiety. It's possible that the genetics of anxiety it is pretty crappy. The evolutionary explanation of anxiety is pretty well worked out. So the question of whether these results would carry across other disorders is, I think, like semi-open. It's indicative, but you definitely can't use it to say, oh, look, evolutionary explanations of autism would be treated similarly, or schizophrenia or whatever. So there's something there which I think we should think about. But I agree that in general, like the clinicians are, one thing, but patients and actually like showing how it impacts the people who are affected and also their family members. There's so much scope for rolling out evolutionary explanations more widely. And yeah, I think it's exciting. It's cool. It is the largest, most rigorous study ever done on evolutionary psychiatry explanations. We should be proud. Thank you to all the people who helped us along the way, of course. Yeah, I guess for me, the thing that really comes through is that it was extremely positive. It was way more positive than I was expecting. And it does give me hope that we can find positive effects, including in patients. I know that, it's also, I maybe it's just like, it's cool to raise how unlikely these sorts of effects are. Like, most of the stigmatization pre-post educational interventions show like much smaller effects, like 0.1, 0.2 standard deviation changes. We're talking like twice that, maybe. And which I think kind of makes sense, because a lot of these anti-stigma interventions are sort of a presentation on how, the people are human too, or they're just like telling some stories about their life and what led them there, and trying to kind of humanize, or just tell clinicians that stigmatization is important and they shouldn't stigmatize. But that's not the same as being given a story as to what's going on here that like instantly reformulates your worldview, in my opinion, on like what the hell is happening here. And I do think that the evolutionary explanation, to have like a half an hour presentation and show like really quite significant increases in depth of understanding, in predicted help seeking and self-stigmatization measures, I think it's really cool, and it aligns with, it justifies my sort of obsession with the field, my intuition, however many years ago, that this would actually be positive. So yeah, thank you so much for being the man on the ground and like doing all this organization. We will be doing more at some point, I assume.
I think we'll do more.
Yeah. There's many other disorders. There's many other people to talk to and to test.
Yeah. We might not have the same setup, because I don't know if I can do that again.
That's the thing is, yeah, I know. We've shot our shot there, and we've sort of used up our goodwill from the training sessions. I mean, hopefully we can just get some money and actually run through like a proper format, and find other ways. There's other ways, but we were just quite bootstrapped about it. So it was good that we could do the bootstrap version, so we can do the larger, more official version.
True, because that did cost us basically anything, did it?
No, nothing at all, really. No, just time, love, sweat, and tears. Yeah. Cool. Well, Tom, thank you for coming on the podcast today to discuss this. Once again, just point people to the paper if they're interested in reading it. I'm sure that I'll be mentioning it for decades to come as a sort of as findings that we've made and that we can build on. And yeah, it's just a great moment. It's very rewarding to have the data kind of in. So yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Adam.
The Evolving Psychiatry podcast is financially supported by the Human Ecology Group of the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine at the University of Zurich.